Welcome to A Course in Graceful Presence. Today we'll be talking about graceful presence and care for the self. Again, just to remind those of you that are participating in this course, this is an ethics and values class. And as I've articulated already before, the study of ethics and values for me is a course in the art of being human, right? All artists create works, and we're all artists of our own lives, and we're all creators of our own character. Art is also a skillful practice, so ethics and values is about living a skillful life, and by that we might say it's a life lived with graceful presence, learning how to live well with yourself in your own skin. It's learning how to overcome the insecurities that we all face, that we all have, the insecurities about our bodies, our intellects, and our status that too often produce in us a guarded self-consciousness where, we feel self-doubt, we doubt ourselves, we feel inadequate, we feel discouragement, we feel stress, anxiety, and fear. So this course is learning how to be present to life and everything that we experience, pleasant and unpleasant, right? With graceful presence. That is, that we are able to cultivate in place of self-doubt a calm self-confidence, that we're able to cultivate in place of a sense of inadequacy, emotional resilience, and in place of, the other dissatisfactions we might feel and discouragements, that we cultivate cheerfulness, and that in place of anxiety and fear, we cultivate a loving and infectious enthusiasm for life. And of course, the name that I've given to this is graceful presence. We've already looked at the 7 practices of cultivating graceful presence, to accept whatever you're feeling in the moment, to not react to your feelings, thoughts, and desires, but to breathe into them. 2, to care for the body, right? To care for your body, because all of our feelings, thoughts, and desires are rooted in our body. So the quality of care of our thoughts, emotions, right, desires will in large part be determined by the quality of care we give to our body. Direct our inner voice, right? Direct our thoughts, control our thoughts by directing our inner voice, how we talk to ourselves, that monologue that's going on inside your head all of the time. Be sure that the language of your inner voice is informed by love, compassion, forgiveness, and empathy. It's focusing on what you can control and learning how to just accept and let go of what you cannot. It's to aspire to the greatness of goodness, to privilege and prioritize in your life the development of knowledge, virtue, and character, and to not care so much about the status goods of money, possessions, and popularity. It's to esteem and treat everyone as you want to be esteemed and treated, right? The golden rule that we find in all of our religious traditions. And because 1 through 6 are difficult to do, it's just doing them for the next 15 minutes, right? Committing to the next 15 minutes. And then the next 15 minutes after that become easier to do. And so now we have to take these 7 practices and see how they might fit into the six relationships that constitute our identity as human beings, right? Every one of us has a relationship to ourself and to others and to our communities, to our physical environment or world, and to the places where we live and the time that we live in. So we want to cultivate graceful presence to those relationships. And today we'll be talking about cultivating graceful presence to the relationship you have with yourself. And we'll be going back to Buddha and Buddhism, because I find that Buddha, perhaps more than any other philosopher we looked at, has a great way of having us cultivate a good, graceful relationship with ourselves. I want to start out with a quote from Shantideva, who was a great Buddhist monk. I think, by the way, those dates might be wrong. I think he was in the Common Era, not before the Common Era. So that was a mistake. Sorry about that. So you might want to fix that in your notes. But he says, all the suffering in the world comes from seeking pleasure for oneself. all the happiness in the world comes from seeking pleasure for others. Or all the happiness there is in the world arises from wishing others to be happy. And all the suffering there is in the world arises from wishing oneself to be happy. Now, why do you think seeking happiness for oneself might bring you suffering and unhappiness? To think about that for a moment, right? And I think maybe we could say that when you want things only for yourself, then either you're unhappy when it doesn't turn out, right? Or your happiness is short-lived when it does. And then you grow again dissatisfied, because the pleasure of desire satisfaction really has a very short shelf life. So why do you think seeking happiness for others might bring you peace and happiness? For some reason, neither the dissatisfaction of failure or the short-lived satisfaction of success seem to affect selfless desires or seeking happiness for others. Buddha argues that there's a joy in spiritual growth, which for him is a movement towards selflessness that is unavailable to selfish people. So we'll have to look at exactly why Buddha might think that seeking happiness for oneself causes unhappiness, whereas seeking happiness for others produces genuine happiness. And to kind of examine that, Buddha is going to teach us that there are kind of two mindsets or ways of being present to yourself, right? There's the presence of craving, the craving of selfish desire, or there's the presence of compassion, the compassion of selfless desire. So you can be present to yourself as a selfish self, it's hard to say, or you can be present to yourself as a selfless self. Now, Buddha will argue that the craving of the selfish self is the cause of all of our misery and unhappiness. And the craving of selfish desire creates a hell on earth and in the world, whereas the compassion of selfless desire, right, the selfless self, is the source of all joy, peace, and happiness, and creates a heaven of peace and joy in the world. When the selfish self directs your thinking, then the result is going to be fear and insecurity, whereas when the selfless self directs your thinking, then confidence and resilience and cheerfulness might be the result. So let's examine that a bit more. Let's examine how you experience your own feelings, thoughts, and desires throughout the day. Have you ever noticed how often and how quickly your emotions and your mental states can change? One moment you're feeling, great, and the next moment you're feeling horrible. There are some common worldly experiences that we all have throughout the day. Every one of us, through the course of the day, has some amount of pleasure and pain. We have some gain and loss. We experience some success and failure, some praise and blame, and some acceptance and rejection, right? These are common worldly experiences that we all have, right? Perhaps already today you felt and experienced a variety of these things. Now, we're conditioned to like pleasant experiences and to dislike unpleasant experiences, right? It's this very conditioning that can make us, or that can boost our unhappiness. You desire that positive experiences will last forever, and you desire that negative experiences never show up or pass quickly, right? So we're conditioned to want pleasure, gain, success, praise, and acceptance. And we're conditioned not to want pain, loss, failure, blame, or rejection. But both of these desires or wishes are impossible, because everything in life is impermanent and nothing lasts. So we find ourselves with unfulfilled desires, right? Or fulfilled desires that don't last very long, which leads to emotional pain and mental distress. And this gets us to Buddha, right, and some of his analysis. Again, back to those ideas, right? This is the emotional mental states most people find themselves in, right? Feeling unfulfilled, unhappy, and dissatisfied, or in a word, they suffer. If this is how you feel sometimes, or a lot of the times, or most of the times, then what Buddha has to say, I think you'll find very appealing, right? Because he was seeking a type of joy and happiness that was not dependent on your experience of pleasure or pain, gain or loss, success or failure, praise or blame, acceptance and rejection. He was seeking a kind of happiness and peace and joy, right, that you could feel regardless of what you were experiencing, right? So let's take a look a bit at Buddha. Of course, his name was Siddhartha Gautama. Buddha is a title. It means, in Pali, to be awake. So every one of us can become Buddhas. We can all become awake in the sense that Buddha was awake or enlightened. He was born about 480 before the Common Era. He lived for about 80 years. He was son of a king in a kingdom at the foot of the Himalayas. At his birth, his father was told by a wise man, a prophet, that Siddhartha would grow up to be either the greatest king ever and unite all of the kingdoms of India, or he would save the world from suffering. Now, if you were Siddhartha's father, what would you want your son to grow up to be? Well, his father wanted him to grow up to be the greatest king ever. So his father devised a plan to keep Siddhartha sheltered so he would never experience, pain or loss or blame or rejection, right? He sheltered Siddhartha from any experience of suffering and unhappiness, thinking that would, keep him on the path to becoming a king and away from the path of, saving the world from suffering. So Siddhartha was indulged. All of his desires were indulged. He lived a very luxurious life. He became a handsome and talented prince, Siddhartha. He married and had a son. He lived in the palace in this very luxurious, indulgent lifestyle until he was about 29 or 30 years old. Now, all along, Siddhartha had a sense that what most people called happiness was a house of cards, easily destroyed, but he couldn't quite figure it out, right? So even in the midst of all of his pleasure and desire, satisfaction, he was haunted by a sense that this wasn't it. Well, finally, when he's about 29 or 30, he persuades his father to let him go outside the palace walls. And here we have the famous story of the 4 sights, the 4 things that Siddhartha saw that propel him on his path to enlightenment. It's kind of interesting to compare this to Socrates in an odd way, right? Socrates was this ordinary brickmaker, and then something happened that changed the course of his life to become a philosopher. Well, Siddhartha, right, it was this moment where he goes outside the palace walls on 4 consecutive nights that changed the course of his life, and he goes from the path of being a great king to becoming, the Buddha, the awakened one. In any case, let's talk about the 4 sights. So he goes outside the palace walls the first night, and he sees sickness. Now imagine that for a moment, right? He's 30 years old. He's never really experienced or seen anyone who was sick. That was always kept from him. He'd always been healthy. But now for the very first time, he sees sickness. And it traumatizes him. He realizes that his own health will eventually turn into sickness and suffering, that everyone eventually gets sick and suffers. He never thought of that before, but no matter how wealthy you are, right, eventually health turns to sickness. He goes out the second night, and this is unfair. That woman is not ugly. I apologize to whoever that might be. But he goes out the second night, and he sees old age, right? He'd been kept from seeing old age. And he realizes that everyone grows old. He saw an old woman on the side of the road who had lost her beauty, perhaps. He thought of his own wife, his beautiful wife, and he realized that even her beauty would eventually, right, fade and turn into ugliness and suffering. That traumatizes him. His own, right, beauty, his own appearance will eventually fade away. He goes out the third night, and he sees death. He sees a corpse on the side of the road. He'd never seen death before. I'm sure that most of you have perhaps seen death. You've been to a viewing or a wake and you've seen a dead body before, but he hadn't. He hadn't really realized that death comes to all of us, right? That life becomes death. So think of that for a moment, right? At 30 years old, he for the first time sees sickness and realizes that health eventually turns into sickness and suffering. At 30 years old, he finally sees old age, the decrepity of old age, right? And he realizes that the beauty of youth turns to the ugliness of old age and suffering. He sees death, and he realizes that his life, right? He's young, he's 30, he's like many of you. You think that you will never die, right? You'll live forever. But he finally realizes when he sees the corpse that life becomes death and suffering. He goes out for one last time, the fourth time, and there he sees a truth seeker. He sees an ascetic, a wise man who is trying to find the truth beyond suffering. And so Buddha, or Siddhartha, realizes that there might be a path, right? There might be a path to escape the suffering that sickness, old age, and death will bring, right? So he decides he's got to find that path. Now, before he goes, his father realizing that Siddhartha is changing, that something is happening to him, his father throws him a big party with beautiful exotic dancers to entertain him and distract him, right? To get him back into the path of sensual pleasure and indulgence. All night long, there's this great party going on with all these beautiful exotic dancers, but in the morning, the party is over. Siddhartha walks through the palace, and he sees all of these beautiful dancers now lying, drunken, in a drunken stupor. And he sees how in the light of day, there's no real beauty or joy in the sensual pleasures. These exotic dancers now all look rather sad and disgusting, right? Again, in the light of day, Buddha or Siddhartha sees that there's no real beauty or joy in sensual pleasure. What had seemed alluring and attractive in the darkness of night or an artificial light, he saw now for what it really was, sad, pathetic, fake, and even disgusting. Now, a personal aside here, if you don't mind. When I was a grad student at Boston College in Boston, I had a job with the Dean of Students, where on the weekends I would, with another grad student, drive around the off-campus housing neighborhoods and try to intervene in loud and obnoxious college parties before the neighbors would call the police in. It was quite an experience. Early in the evening, these college students all looked sober and attractive, and they were having a great time. But by midnight, it was quite another scene. Driving around those neighborhoods trying to, keep the cops from breaking up the parties. I saw these young men and young women, half-dressed, barfing all over the street, yelling and screaming obscenities at us and at their neighbors while peeing on the grass, right? Giving themselves over to sensual pleasure. They had become sad, pathetic, and disgusting, and quite embarrassed and unhappy by the next morning. But like I said, back to Buddha, right, or Siddhartha, Buddha sought a joy that wasn't subject to the constant ups and downs of life. He sought a happiness that wasn't subject to the experience of pleasure or pain, gain or loss, success or failure, praise or blame, acceptance or rejection, right? He sought a joy that wasn't subject to the highs and lows of ordinary human experience, the roller coaster of human emotions, where, again, one moment we feel great and almost, and all right, and the very next moment we feel terrible. He wanted a peace and a happiness that was not dependent on pleasure or pain, gain or, as I said, that pain or pleasure, gain or loss, success or failure, praise or blame, acceptance or rejection. And he found it. He found this joy, this happiness in his insight into the nature of desire. And I think this is perhaps one of his great contributions, this examination into the nature of desire. First off, desire is mimetic, which means it's imitative. We tend to desire what other people have, right? That's the only thing that can explain why we like these huge SUVs, in a city anyway. The only reason we might like this large, ridiculous Hummer is because someone else has it, and that evokes our own desire for it. Again, we tend to desire what other people have. and we're unhappy if we don't have it. So with that kind of as a background, let's take a look at the structure of desire. And there are 3 stages to desire. Stage 1 is the arousal of desire, when you see something that looks attractive to have or possess, and you think that you can't be happy or satisfied until you have it or possess it. Now, our Buddha said that there were 3 types of such objects that would arouse our desire. One was sense pleasure, things that gave, sensual or bodily pleasure, things like food, sex, entertainment, even books. A scholar who takes tremendous pleasure at doing nothing but reading books could be thought of as someone who's captured by the sensual pleasure of books. Second is personal aggrandizement, right? Things that give you status, wealth, positions, or titles. And the third type of object that would arouse desire was forgetfulness, things that make you forget how dissatisfying your life is. This explains, addictions to drugs and alcohol. So stage 1 is the arousal of desire, when you see something that looks attractive to have or possess. Let's go to stage 2. Stage 2 is the seeking stage, right, where you strive to acquire the objects that you desire. Now, it's important to realize that desire is awareness of a lack, right? You lack something you believe you need for happiness. Now, this experience of a lack produces pain, dissatisfaction, and unhappiness by its very nature. Desire by its very nature makes you dissatisfied with your life. Think about that for a moment, right? Every time you desire something for yourself, in that moment, you make yourself dissatisfied with your life just as it is, right? And that brings unhappiness. Buddha realized that dissatisfaction is the enemy of happiness, and desire is dissatisfaction. So the more you desire, the more unhappy you'll be, right? Again, think about this. Buddha realized that if you increase desire, you decrease happiness. If you decrease desire, you increase happiness. This kind of suggests 2 approaches to a happy life, right? One approach might be to desire a lot of things and acquire them, right? Who has the most toys wins. Or secondly, right, to minimize what you want and be content with what you have. Well, let's go to the third stage of desire, right? The satisfaction stage. You acquire what you desire, but now are you happy, right? So when you satisfy that desire for sensual pleasure, personal aggrandizement, or forgetfulness, right, in the moment that you satisfy that desire, the pain is replaced by pleasure. Dissatisfaction is replaced by satisfaction, and unhappiness is replaced by happiness. But will it last, right? Because the nature of things, the nature of life is constant change and impermanence. After a short time, what once brought you pleasure no longer does. We all know what this is like. We finally acquire something that we want. But before long, we grow bored and dissatisfied with it and want other things. So again, selfish desire is the cause of our chaotic emotional life and unhappiness, right? Selfish desire, in a way then, is the cause of a dysfunctional relationship to yourself. So if you have a problematic, unhappy relationship with yourself, it's because, right, you're captured with selfish desire. You're present to yourself with selfish desire. Again, selfish desire is the cause of our chaotic emotional life and our unhappiness with ourselves. So mindfulness that Buddha taught is the key practice of graceful presence and care for the self. And it is to understand in your own emotional and mental states the nature of desire. It's to understand how selfish and selfless desires affect your mental and emotional states. Well, we need to talk for a moment about selfless desire. Exactly, because if graceful presence to the self is to be present to yourself with selfless desire. Exactly what does that mean, right? So again, selfish desire or craving is wanting the world to make you happy and expecting that only when you get what you want can you be happy, right? But selfish desires only bring suffering, unhappiness, and dissatisfaction. Here's a great quote from the Dhammapada, right? The compulsive urges of the thoughtless grow like a creeper. A creeper is an obnoxious plant, right? They jump like a monkey from one life to another looking for fruit in the forest. Obviously, you don't find fruit in the forest, you find fruit in an orchard. So selfish desires is seeking happiness in the wrong place. When these urges drive us, sorrow spreads like wild grass. Conquer these fierce cravings and sorrow will fall away from your life like drops of water from a lotus leaf, right? Again, selfish desire is wanting something you lack, right? That you think will make you happy. This experience of lack causes dissatisfaction and suffering. And the satisfaction of that lack is short-lived and only brings more dissatisfaction. So what kind of wanting or desiring would not be wanting something you lack, so it wouldn't produce unhappiness? Or what kind of wanting or desiring could be thought of as selfless desire, right? This is kind of tricky. So selfless desire would be wanting life to be exactly as it is, because you already have everything you need to be happy. You lack nothing. So selfless desire or compassion is enjoying life just as it is, not wanting to get anything from it, but to give to it through a compassionate service to all living things. It's not getting, but giving that produces joy, peace, and happiness, right? Buddha believes that loving your life just as it is, finding in the present moment everything you need for happiness, allows you to have compassion for others. You see clearly and compassionately, or your compassion is the lens through which you see life. Selfish desires, right, cloud our vision. So you see the world through the lens of fear, anger, resentment, envy, and pride. Only selfless desires, right, give you the eyes of compassion, so you can see life as it really is, full of joy, peace, and happiness. Now, don't take Buddha's word for it, right? Experiment with this, right? Figure out, again, this is caring for the self, figure out how selfish desires and selfless desires affect your emotional and mental state. So here's an experiment you can try, right? Take one day and just give it over completely to selfish desires, right? Spend one day doing everything to make yourself happy, right? Spend one day just focused on sensual pleasures, right? And personal aggrandizement. At the end of the day, see what your emotional and mental states are like, right? Now, the next day, give it totally to selfless desires, right? Spend the next day not seeking your own happiness through sensual pleasure and personal aggrandizement, but spend the next day, right, doing things for other people, right? Being of compassionate service to those around you. So thinking not of yourself, but of others. At the end of that day, see how your emotional and mental states are, right? And then see what day was happier. What day was a day of greater peace and joy, right? Now, we might sum it up and say to be enlightened like Buddha, to be awake like Buddha, is nothing mysterious or complicated. It's simply knowing how to live well with yourself and your own skin and body, with its complicated feelings, confusing thoughts, and contradictory desires, without reacting to any of your moods, or not needing or wanting anything other than to be present to your life and that moment with compassion, which is to have nothing but loving kindness and sympathy for yourself and all other living things. Easy, right? I know you can do it. I believe in you, so start today. perhaps start with that little simple experiment. Spend one day trying to satisfy your own selfish desires, and spend the next day, right, in a selfless mode, trying to compassionately be present and serve others, and just see what day was a better day for you. The end. The access code for the quiz this time is 5481. And again, I thank you very much for your attendance.